Welcome to Machine Learning for Mathematicians. This course is for people who already know mathematics and want to see what machine learning does with it. Over 32 lectures, we will derive the results the field relies on, implement each one, and check it against the answer a machine computes. Today, we set up the problem the whole subject is trying to solve, and we find out why it cannot be solved directly. Here is the thesis. Machine learning is not short of mathematics. What it is short of is the step between a formula and the line of code that computes it. Look at the pairs on this table. A linear map applied to a vector becomes a matrix product with a transpose that nobody explains. A gradient step becomes a single method call. The Jacobian of the softmax is a matrix that a library never actually forms. Scaled dot product attention becomes one fused kernel that looks nothing like the formula. And the gradient of the loss becomes a call to backward. Each of those is a translation somebody has to perform, and almost no course performs it in front of you. This one does, and then it checks the answer numerically. Let me be precise about what I am assuming. You should be comfortable with linear algebra, including eigendecomposition and the singular value decomposition. You should know multivariable calculus and ideally think of the chain rule as a statement about composing linear maps. You need probability at the level of expectations, variances, and the law of large numbers. And you need enough Python to read it, not to write it. I'm assuming no machine learning whatsoever. No measure theory, because nothing here needs it. No functional analysis. And no familiarity with any framework. If you hold a degree in mathematics, physics, statistics, or engineering, then the mathematics in this course is not the hard part for you. The hard part is that this field writes it differently, computes it differently, and justifies it differently from anything in your training. First, the problem itself. What is the quantity that machine learning is actually trying to make small, and why can nobody ever evaluate it? Fix a set of inputs and a set of outputs. There is a joint distribution on pairs of them which we never observe. What we do observe is a sample of some number of pairs drawn independently from that distribution. We then choose a hypothesis class, a family of functions indexed by a parameter, and a loss function, which is a non-negative number measuring the cost of predicting one output when the truth was another. The object we would like to make small is called the population risk. It is the expected loss, where the expectation is taken over the very distribution we never see. And there is the difficulty in one sentence. The population risk is an expectation over something we do not have, so it cannot be evaluated, let alone minimized. Everything in the rest of this course is a consequence of that single fact. It is worth being pedantic about what is random here, because this is where a trained mathematician's reflexes need adjusting. The underlying distribution is fixed and unknown. It is never observed, not even approximately. The sample is random. It is one draw, and everything computed from it inherits that randomness. Now, the important one. The fitted parameter is random because it is a function of the sample. That is the fact people skip over. Since the parameter is random, the population risk evaluated at that parameter is random too, being a deterministic function of a random argument. Only the minimum of the population risk over the class is deterministic, and that is a property of the distribution and the class alone. So a sentence like the model achieves a risk of some number is a statement about one realization. The interesting questions are all about the distribution of that realization. I introduce the loss as if it were given. It is not. Choosing a loss is a statement about what you believe the noise to be, and in Lecture 9 we will show that every common loss function is a negative log likelihood wearing a disguise. Squared error corresponds to Gaussian noise with fixed variance, and it seeks the mean, which is why it is sensitive to outliers. Absolute error corresponds to Laplace noise. It seeks the median, and it is robust for exactly that reason. Cross entropy corresponds to a categorical distribution, and it is the only sane choice when the outputs are labels. The consequence is worth holding on to. Changing your assumption about the noise changes one line of code. That correspondence is not folklore. It is a derivation, and we will do it. Next, the substitute we actually minimize, and the two quite different ways it can mislead us. The population risk is an expectation, and we have independent samples from the right distribution, so replace the expectation by a sample average. That average is called the empirical risk. For a fixed value of the parameter, this is exactly a Monte Carlo estimate. It is unbiased, meaning its expectation is the population risk, and its variance falls like 1 over the number of samples, which is the ordinary rate you would expect. One word about the leading factor of 1 over the number of samples. That is a choice rather than part of the definition. If you sum the losses instead of averaging them, every gradient is scaled by the sample size, which silently rescales your learning rate. The library default is the mean, and this course follows it throughout. Now here is the trap. The phrase for a fixed value of the parameter carries the entire difficulty. We never evaluate the empirical risk at a fixed parameter. We minimize over the parameter, and the minimizer depends on the very sample used to build the average. Write theta hat for the parameter we actually compute, and theta star for the best member of the hypothesis class. Then the excess risk, meaning how much worse we are than the best possible predictor of any kind, splits into two pieces. The first piece compares what we computed against the best member of our class. That is called estimation error. The second compares the best member of our class against the best predictor there is. That is called approximation error. These two behave in opposite ways. Approximation error depends on the class and the distribution, and not at all on the sample, and it shrinks as the class grows richer. Estimation error depends on the sample size and on the particular sample, and it grows as the class grows richer. 2 frames from now, we will measure both of them. An obvious question at this point is why not simply collect more data? Often that is exactly the right answer, and it is worth knowing when it is not. Estimation error typically falls like 1 over the square root of the number of samples. So halving it costs 4 times the data, and reducing it tenfold costs 100 times the data. There are 3 situations where more samples do not help at all. First, when approximation error dominates. If your class cannot express the target, no quantity of data closes that gap, and the fix is more capacity rather than more samples. Second, when the distribution shifts. Samples drawn from something other than the deployment distribution estimate the wrong expectation, and collecting more of them estimates the wrong thing more precisely. Third, when the noise is irreducible. No model and no sample size predicts below the noise floor. So let us measure it. 15 noisy samples of a fixed smooth target on the interval from -1 to 1, fitted by least squares with polynomials of increasing degree. The third column is the error of the best polynomial of that degree against the noiseless target, so it isolates approximation error alone. Read down the columns. Training error falls the whole way monotonically, and at the top degree it reaches exactly 0 because a polynomial of that degree can interpolate all 15 points. Test error does not. It falls, then it turns at degree 6, and then it climbs catastrophically. Meanwhile, the approximation error goes to 0. That is the whole lesson. At the top degree, some polynomial fits the target perfectly, and the one we computed is roughly 40,000 times worse than the modest degree 6 fit. Training risk told us nothing about any of this. Now 3 places where a mathematician's instincts, which are good instincts, will actively mislead in this subject. The first instinct is that convergence theory will tell you what happens. It will not, and the reason deserves to be stated precisely, rather than waved at. The standard guarantees for gradient descent assume some combination of the following: that the objective is convex, or at least satisfies a Polyak-Loyashevich condition, that it is smooth with the Lipschitz constant on the gradient, that the step size is tied to that constant, and that the gradients are exact, or that stochastic gradients come with a prescribed decaying step. Now take a deep network trained in practice and check those hypotheses one at a time. The objective is not convex. The Lipschitz constant is not known, and it is not even a constant along the trajectory. The step size people actually use is routinely larger than the stable range the theory permits. And training works anyway. The theorems are correct. Their hypotheses simply do not hold. In this course, we will be honest, every single time, about which statements are theorems and which are empirical regularities. The second instinct is that more parameters must mean worse generalization. The polynomial table said exactly that, and it is the classical picture, and it is genuinely what happens there. But it stops being true, and the way it fails is not subtle. Modern networks are routinely trained with far more parameters than training points, driven to zero training error, and they generalize well. Worse, if you take the same networks and fit them to randomly relabeled data, they also reach zero training error. That means the class is expressive enough to memorize pure noise. So no bound that depends only on the class can possibly explain why the real labels generalize and the random ones do not. The classical picture is not wrong. The polynomial fit really does what it appears to do. The picture is incomplete. Capacity measured by counting parameters is the wrong axis, and finding the right one is an open problem. The third instinct is that a bound which is vacuous is useless. Consider a generalization bound of the familiar shape, empirical risk, plus a term built from the complexity of the class divided by the number of samples, all under a square root. That is a theorem. Substitute realistic numbers for a modern network, and the right-hand side exceeds 1, while the loss itself is bounded by 1. The bound is true, and it tells you nothing. This is uncomfortable if you are used to bounds being the point. Here it is normal. But a vacuous bound can still have the right shape. It can tell you that risk ought to fall like 1 over the square root of the sample size. Whether it does is a testable prediction, and Lecture 13 tests it. So read a bound for its functional form first, and its constant second. Let me balance that because not everything you know is in question. Several things carry over completely unchanged, and we will lean on them constantly. The chain rule, understood as composing linear maps, is the whole of backpropagation and nothing more. Linearity of expectation is precisely what makes a mini-batch gradient an unbiased estimate of the full gradient. The spectral theorem and the singular value decomposition run principal component analysis, low-rank adaptation, and a great deal of what happens inside attention. Convex duality is where the support vector machine and several regularizers come from. And numerical stability, which is the most transferable skill of all and the least taught, gets an entire lecture of its own. So the mathematics is not the obstacle. The obstacle is that it arrives without its usual labels, and it is computed by machinery that has reorganized it for speed. Finally, how this course actually works, and the conventions we will hold fixed for the next 32 lectures. Every lecture from here follows the same 3 beats. First, we derive. The derivation happens on the slide in full with the convention stated, and I will not assert a result that can be derived in the time available. Second, we implement. That means the 8 or 10 lines that actually compute the thing, short enough to read aloud and runnable exactly as written. Third, we check. A number printed by a script that was actually run, which would come out different if the derivation were wrong. That third beat is the one almost nobody does, and it is the entire point of this course. A derivation you have not checked against automatic differentiation is a derivation you have not finished. So here is a promise. Every number that appears on every slide in this course came out of a run. None of them were typed. These conventions are all contested somewhere in the literature, so I am stating each of them once, here, and holding them for the whole course. Vectors are columns, always. At the boundary with code, we switch to index notation, which privileges neither rows nor columns, and which transcribes directly into an nin sum call. Gradients use denominator layout, so the gradient of the loss has the same shape as the parameter. Batches are reduced by taking a mean, matching the library default. Logarithms are natural, and information is measured in nats rather than bits. And objectives are always stated as minimizing a negative log likelihood, never as maximizing a likelihood. One apparent conflict deserves a word now. Mathematics writes a matrix acting on a column vector, while the library computes a product with a transpose. That is a storage fact, not a mathematical one, and next lecture shows the transpose costs nothing at all. The reading spine for this course is Prince, Understanding Deep Learning, pinned at version 5.0.3. I have pinned the version deliberately because he revises it and section numbers move. 3 reasons for that choice. It is free, so everyone watching can actually follow along. It ships 68 notebooks to practice on, and its chapter order matches ours closely. Alongside it, Dyson-Roth, Fiesel, and Ong for matrix calculus and optimization, Hayem for numerical stability, and primary papers wherever the books skip a derivation. Now, why Prince rather than a more rigorous text? The answer is that he states much of what we derive, and that is exactly the right relationship between a textbook and this course. When his chapter on transformers tells you that attention divides by a square root and does not say why, that is not a defect in the book. That is Lecture 22. Here is the whole road. Lectures 1 through 4 build a dictionary, after which you can read an equation and find the line of code that computes it. Lectures 5 through 12 are gradients you can check, after which you can derive any backward pass and verify it yourself. Lectures 13 through 19 are optimization, after which you can say why atom has the specific terms it has. Lectures 20 through 25 are attention, after which you can derive a transformer, including the part the original paper gets wrong. Lectures 26 through 29 are probability and generative models, after which a diffusion paper reads as mathematics. And the last 3 are geometry and open problems. That final part is not decoration. Optimization on manifolds, equivariance, and conservation are where a mathematician has genuine leverage, and they connect directly to the geometric mechanics lectures on this channel. A few practicalities. Lectures come out one at a time in order. Members see each one 2 weeks before it goes public, and everything goes public eventually. Lecture 22 stands alone, so if you only ever watch one of these, make it that one. Every figure on every slide is produced by a script, one per lecture, and you see the output of that run on the frame itself. The scripts and the problem sets go to channel members, with worked solutions at the top tier. If you get stuck, the mathematics is usually not the obstacle. Reread the shape annotation first, because 9 times in 10 the confusion is about which axis something was summed over. Princess notebooks are the gentlest place to practice, and a warning worth taking seriously. Watching a derivation is not at all the same as being able to produce one. Re-derive one from the slide or run the script before you believe that you could. It is a short experiment and an unwelcome one, and it is the only honest test there is. Let me gather the 5 things worth keeping. First, the quantity we actually want is the population risk, an expectation over a distribution we never observe. It cannot be evaluated, and every complication in the subject follows from that. Second, we minimize the empirical risk instead. It is unbiased for each fixed parameter, and that is precisely the condition which fails the moment we minimize over the parameter. Third, excess risk splits into approximation error and estimation error, and those two move in opposite directions as the hypothesis class grows richer. Fourth, we measured it on a polynomial fit. Training risk fell monotonically all the way to exactly 0, while test risk climbed past 10,000, and the approximation error vanished throughout. Training risk carries no information about generalization. Fifth, convergence theory, capacity counting, and non-vacuous bounds all fail here in ways worth naming out loud, while the chain rule, linearity of expectation, and the spectral theorem do not. Next time we do tensors properly as multilinear algebra meeting memory layout, and we settle that transpose question for good.